For example, by bringing forgotten rivers and culverted rivers to the surface once again, we are reintroducing cosmic influences to the landscape. Many years ago, I became very interested in what remains of the River Fleet, which is culverted underground. The energies in King's Cross, where there's a lot of drugs being peddled, around, I was sure was influenced by this river that was trapped under the ground. So I actually contacted the River Fleet Society and also referenced Louise's article in
Legendary London.
Yes, Legendary London, where she actually mentions that this culverting of rivers goes back probably to the founding of the Royal Society, which is a very interesting parallel if you look at it. So, being especially interested in the River Fleet, there we go. There's an early picture of how it was originally flowing into the Thames at Blackfriars Bridge. And a very scruffy note that I, if I can find it, got from their archives. Under the street you're now walking along flows a river, the River Fleet. Over the last 200 years it has been buried by roads and pavements. We are people who feel strongly that the river can be opened and flow again through the heart of our city. And then at the bottom, imagination is the root of all change. And from your lovely stories yesterday, I only had the one in the evening, this marvellous stress on being able to create the future, to create the possibility. And here we have, I'm speaking from the spiritual science or anthroposophy of Dr. Rudolf Steiner. That's my particular slant on the subject. And there is a link to all that was going on yesterday with the wonderful storytelling and with the work of Gatekeeper. That's why the Gatekeeper butterfly is there. Rudolf Steiner's exercises for rising spiritually was to begin with developing imagination, imaginative qualities as the first rung to a ladder to spiritual cognition, then inspiration, and finally intuition, and there's a whole lot to be said about that. Now, a pupil of Rudolf Steiner's, because anthroposophy is also spiritual science, so I'm going to get a bit scientific. I'm not a scientist myself, but I'm very interested in the marrying of the imagination, of the wonderful things that are done through meditation, with an actual science of the spirit, which is necessary, I feel, to really combat the things that are going on in today's world. And in a book called Man or Matter, written by Rudolf Steiner's pupil Ernst Lehrs, who was a scientist, he quotes the words of Professor Alexis Carrel in his book Man the Unknown, which was published by Burns and Oates in London in 1961. Outside the human body, the quantity of liquid which would be necessary to prevent all of the tissue being poisoned by its own waste products equals 45,000 gallons. Inside the human body, the blood achieves the same task with 1.5 gallons. So if you're confronted by a very pedantic scientist, you could always, they like figures. There's figures for you. Work out how that happens. So now I would like to follow the path of healing energy, which we've spoken about, we've heard about so brilliantly this morning, that has its source in the wide spaces of the cosmos, tracing it through the ancient notion of the music of the spheres, as it is mysteriously transferred through sound phenomena into the fluid systems of the earth and of its creatures. And in doing this, I will be drawing on Rudolf Steiner's Science of the Grail, his statements on you'll hear the 4 ethers, the 2 higher ethers, subdivisions of the life force, being represented by the Holy Grail itself in the Grail legends, and the tree of life in the Genesis account of paradise before the fall. And in following this path, I found wonderful corroboration for Rudolf Steiner's research in the work of 2 Austrian scientists. And in 1993, I attended a 3-day seminar given by a Dr. Gernot Gräfer, an Austrian biologist working in humus, not the nice stuff you put on toast, but in humus research. And he led a long-time research project for the Austrian Academy of Science and for the Ministry of Science and Research, and Dr. Maria Felsenreich, who collaborated with him, who had done a lot of work in environmental and agricultural research. And together they had studied the life-bearing properties of water. So a group of us, quite a large group, hied off down to Stroud, and there we spent 3 days learning from Dr. Gräfer and Dr. Felsenreich. But they had no spiritual intentions of what they were doing. It was pure science. They didn't want to hear about anything to do with spirit. Dr. Felsenreich came from a very strict Catholic background, and she left all that behind. It had nothing to do with anthroposophy. It was their research. So we put all our thoughts behind us and neatly listened. And they spoke about how, in its natural healthy state, water can be doused for 9 clearly identified resonance formations. The transformation of these resonance formations leads to the build-up of corresponding information fields which stand in relation to specific chemical elements, vital functions, and magnetic patterns. This is not a yes or no dowsing. This is actually holding the pendulum over the water you wish to test, and it will do any or some of these 9 patterns. Unfortunately, no time to demonstrate it today, and I left the pendulum behind anyway. But this is a huge area of research. Unfortunately, Gernot Gräfer died years ago, and I don't know what's happened to Maria Felsenreich. But as we were sitting there and listening to this, and as they were telling us all the different things they wanted us to know, I realized that their work was running very much parallel to Rudolf Steiner's research and to those people who followed him. And one of these was Theodor Schwenk, who wrote the wonderful book Sensitive Chaos, in which he says the world of moving water absorbs influences from the constellations of the stars in the heavens and passes them on to the earth and its creatures. Cosmic events, the world of water, and the living creatures in it form a totality. Compare this to Gernot and Maria's statements. Energy transfer has to be understood as the basis for life on Earth. Our planet was shaped by the evolution of water, which was, is, and will be the media for the transport of vibrational energy. The Earth body's most characteristic feature is its resounding quality, which differs from region to region and from one level of evolution to another. We may call this resounding quality of the Earth body music. The resounding system of the Earth underwent so many changes that it is very difficult to reconstruct those parts that were completely lost long ago. And very often in their lectures to us, they spoke about the paradise situation of the Earth, even though they didn't believe in paradise or anything. And so here you have a very interesting quotation from Steiner's lectures on the Egyptian myths and legends, where he actually goes back to the very beginnings of Earth evolution in a very scientific way, but at the same time showing how science, legend, and fairy tale can be brought together if one knows how to do it. That there is truth in fairy tale and legend. This is all fact that is passed on to us from very, very ancient times. Also, a record of the beginnings of the earth. From the beginning, the earth was not only glowing and shining, but was also resounding. It is really not easy to portray the splendour of the earth at that time. We must picture it as a light-filled globe, shone round by light-bearing clouds and generating wonderful phenomena of light and colour. The luminous masses surged back and forth. Within were all the human beings of today, woven through by all the spiritual beings who rayed forth light in manifest grandeur and beauty. Outside was the earth cosmos in its great variety. Inside, with the light flowing about him, was man, in close connection with the divine spiritual beings, raying streams of light into the outer light sphere. And if we use a bit of imagination, Fiona MacLeod speaks about the western regions of the north of England. The skies to the west beyond the sea were not built of flushed clouds, but of transparent flame. These flames rose in solemn stillness above a vast forge, whose anvil was the shining breast of the sea. Who among you knows the way to the divine forges? And this area, we now get very down to earth and boring. A geological map showing the Western Isles, and particularly the basalt formations. And here I think we have Staffa, this little tiny pink spot. So a connection between paradise and basalt. And if we continue, Gerlotte and Maria said that basalt is a magma stone. All the elements are present in basalt. It is heavier than the other stones in the earth's mantle. It is magnetite. The properties of basalt make it very difficult for us to influence it. It brings us back to this world, to reality. It has the greatest ability and quality of any stone to give one the right answers when used as a pendulum. And the particular pendulums that they gave us came from Polyberg in Austria, from a very deep region in the earth, and contains more minerals than the upper crust. It is 8 million years old. Black magnetite and iron oxide, many crystalline structures in it, and very slightly radioactive. All the elements are present. It is compatible with all other substances. And here, the little tiny pink spot, is Fingal's Cave, made of these wonderful basalt pillars. And here is a lovely bit again from Fiona MacLeod. We find ourselves confronted in these western regions with the most vivid pictures of the twilight of the old mysteries. And the most vivid of all, perhaps, are those grouped around the hero Fionn, or Fingal. With him and with his associates, we find ourselves listening to the last echoes of the old hearing of the old spiritual sounds, the hearing of the voices of the spirits of the light and air and water as they fought their titanic battles with darkness and the hardening forces of the rocks. Ossian converted this spiritual hearing into the music of his songs and carried its inspiration out into the world. Nowhere are there to be found more wonderful descriptions of the voices of the wraiths echoing in the wild winds, or their cloudy formations drifting in the pale moonlight, or shining in the wreathing mists of that land of ancient, deathless beauty. Fingal's Cave to this day is likened to the ear of the world. And we understand how Mendelssohn wrote his piece, Fingal's Cave. A friend of mine actually flew over Fingal's Cave in a light aircraft, and she said she could swear that above the sound of the waves below, she could hear music. So something there, something working there. And here we go to Rudolf Steiner's, no, we're still here. There we go. To Theodor Schrenck again, speaking from the anthroposophical viewpoint. And he speaks about how the world of moving water absorbs influences from the constellations of the stars in the heavens and passes them on to the earth and its creatures. Cosmic events, the world of water and the living creatures in it form a totality. Every stretch of water carries its own characteristic vibration, which is close to the vibration of the moon. The closer this is, the more easily is the water influenced. And now if we look at, whoops, I think we've gone too far. No, we haven't. The music of the spheres is received in the astral body, then in the etheric body, and communicated to the physical body through the fluid medium, through water. And there is a special connection between our astral body, let's see, and something I'm going to speak in more detail about, you just bear with me for the moment, what Steiner described as the chemical ether and the moon. So the moon is connected to this particular aspect of the life force which Steiner mentioned as the chemical ether. Astrality is the seat of our feeling life. Tears of joy and grief demonstrate how we are feeling and the situation in our astral body. And it is the higher of the subtle principles which work into the physical. And as we heard earlier, the etheric manifests through time, through rhythms. The astral manifests through harmony, pitch, the spaces between things. The astral body is the source of our feelings, our emotions, and we express these by the pitch in our voice. So that if you hear an actor who wishes to convey to the audience a sense of menace, if the voice goes high and then low, the distance between that note and the lower note will give a corresponding feeling to those who are listening. Or the painter who is working with tones of colour has a certain emotion, a certain feeling in his astral body. He takes the paint and he puts the tones of colour, and the way they interact then should give the observer the same feeling repeated from the feeling that was actually put into the colours by the painter himself. Now, the life force has been described as the etheric, as I think all of you know, I don't need to tell you, and it's just to be very basic. The function of the life force is to bring matter into being and give it life, and also to bring into matter information which will qualify and differentiate. And we were saying at breakfast how, as one does, how Rudolf Steiner separated the life force into 4 different activities, a sort of higher octave of the actual elements. So at the highest point you have what Steiner described as the life, I haven't put it here, or meaning ether, relating down to the deepest of the elements to the solid state. Then he relates to the chemical ether, which is connected to the fluid state. Then lower, the light ether, relating to a higher element, to gas and to air. And then the border between matter and spirit, the warmth ether, which, of course, when we light a candle, we are immediately linking ourselves to the beginning of the etheric world. So it's the sort of the border state, the threshold of the beginning of entering the spiritual world. So at a certain point in evolution, it happened that the close interpenetration of these four aspects of the life force was interrupted by the event described in the Bible as the fall, by Lucifer. And recently I've been doing a lot of research into the whole question of Lucifer, and I can't go into it in great detail now, but it really was part of a divine plan, although it sounds very strange, that Lucifer interrupted evolution so that we eventually could attain to freedom, and if we get our act right, to return to paradise, but in a very different, distant time. And Steiner talks about how the story of the tree of knowledge and the tree of life in the book of Genesis actually describes a real event that happened on the earth at the time of the fall, where Lucifer entered into the warmth and the light ether, which is what we use when we think. Our thoughts are actually activated by the warmth and the light ether. And before this, when the bit I read to you about the paradise state, we were thought through by the hierarchies, by the angelic beings above us. After the event in paradise, when Lucifer entered into these first two of the ethers, our thinking was separated from divine thinking. So we became individual people. We became free of the spiritual world, and we gradually lost our position in paradise. Not our fault, not anything to do with original sin. We weren't in any position, we were far too immature at that time to be responsible. This was an act of the gods. It was an act of higher beings giving us the most enormous test so that eventually we might become, return to paradise as individuals. And these two ethers are, and when you think of something, it's a sort of instigation for what you're going to do next. Because the tree of life, the chemical, sound, tone, or number ether, carrying information, causing differentiation, and the life ether, the coming into being of matter, if you apply the first two, thinking, to creating, if everything had remained as it was, human beings would have been able to create into matter living beings. And I'll come to that a little bit later, because it has been attempted recently, but not with any particular success. So the coming into being of matter, the chemical and the life ether, implementing the instigation begun by the two lower ethers. So as a result of this, all sorts of chaos was let loose. The sexes were separated, and that's another talk. And Steiner describes how 6 Elohim of the fourth hierarchy of angels, manifesting the Logos, the Christ, which was the sound that was resounding through the paradise state, removed the life ether, the highest of the ethers, to form a new celestial body in space, the present sun. The earth was then left with only moon forces, which sometime later were removed by the 7th Elohim to form our present moon, the 7th Elohim being Yahweh, or Jehovah. And Steiner gives a description of the time when only the earth and the moon were left together. And this was a time when the snake form was actually, in the dragon form, was developing on earth. So this is where you get the connection with Lucifer, the dragon. And he describes how, with the life ether having been removed, he says how the tone, the sound, had remained in the earth. So when the light departed, the water became dark, but also drenched with tone. It was tone that gave form to the water. We see that tone is something formative, a shaping force, since through tone the parts are arranged in order. Tone is a shaping power, and it is this that formed the body out of the water. This was the force of tone which had remained in the earth. It was sound, tone, rang through the earth, out of which the human form had shaped itself. And Gernot and Paul Emerson, of Anthroposophy, which is a new organisation actually operating from that northern part of Scotland. In the region of the British Isles, volcanoes broke through the granite rocks of the Caledonian Massif far back in Lemurian times before Atlantis, creating the ancient volcanic rocks of Cumbria and Northumbria, Strathclyde and Argyll. This introduced a new element into the character of these parts of the Massif. Later, in Atlantean times, new volcanoes thrust up through the granite crust and poured out their lava, building the so-called basalt ridge beneath the Atlantic. And we remember what Gernot and Maria had said about the basalt, and Rudolf Steiner, again in his lectures on the Egyptian myths and legends, speaks of how during the fall, the time was now approaching during which the basest forces were hurled out. Mighty catastrophes shook the earth, and for the occultist, the basalt formations appear as the remnants of the cleansing forces that rocked the globe when the moon had separated from the earth. This was also the time when the water core of the earth, condensed more and more, and the firm mineral kernel gradually evolved. And here again, energy transfer has to be understood as the basis for life on Earth. Our planet was shaped by the evolution of water, and this is Gernot and Maria. No connection to Steiner at all, which was, is, and will be the media for the transport of vibrational energy. The Earth body's most characteristic feature is its resounding quality, which differs from region to region and from one level of evolution to another. We may call this resounding quality of the Earth body music. The resounding system of the Earth underwent so many changes that it is very difficult to reconstruct those parts that were completely lost long ago. And we hear in the Bible about how after the crucifixion, St. John and the Virgin Mary travelled to Ephesus, which when there in Ephesus was a mystery centre which was particularly teaching the mysteries of sound in creation. Therefore, it's understandable that the beginning of John's Gospel should say, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God." Sound, the beginning of everything. And another pupil of Rudolf Steiner's, Gunther Wachsmuth, who researched the ethers in great detail, actually asks the question, if I can get it, there we are, whence came the Christ? Rudolf Steiner speaks of how the Christ entered into Jesus of Nazareth in the 30th year, so it's a very different idea to the traditional idea. He came from those very regions which have been closed to man by the temptation of Lucifer, from the region of the music of the spheres, from the region of the cosmic life. With his soul, man really belongs to the region of the living cosmic ether, but he was driven out from it. And so it is to be given him again, so that by degrees he may once more be able to imbue himself with that which he had forfeited. So these two higher ethers have also been described by Steiner as the Holy Grail, the life ether connected with the solid state, the highest etheric state, energy before matter, the coming into being of matter or the coming into matter of being, the chemical, sound, number or tone ether connected with the fluid state, bringing into life forms information which will qualify and differentiate. And this is a symbol of the Holy Grail that was seen by an anthroposophical doctor about an hour before he died, representing the beginning of, paradise, when earth, moon, and all the forces of the zodiac were actually one cosmic body, a totally spiritual body, the earth in its paradise state. So, with the dynamic of the fall, and with the removal of the higher, more subtle energy from the earth, most of it, the ethers were subjected to this dynamic and caused what Rudolf Steiner has described as the centric forces. The warmth ether remains as it is. It's the barrier, it's the threshold. The light ether becomes electricity. The chemical ether becomes magnetism. The life ether becomes what Rudolf Steiner described as the third force. And he said, pray God, when the third force is discovered by humanity, humanity will have nothing immoral left in him. And two anthroposophical scientists actually discussed the nature of the third force at a conference, and one said, do you think this is nuclear energy? And the other replied, no, that's only the tip of the iceberg. It's something very, very powerful. You could perhaps say Kali, one doesn't know, but something we don't yet, luckily, know too much about. And Steiner also speaks about how our present Earth is the fourth incarnation of three previous planetary states. And he shows how the first was a purely spiritual state, ancient Saturn. No matter, no fluid, no gas and air, no light. Halfway or some way through it, the beginnings of matter just in the form of differentiated warmth. And the actual temperature of human blood, the normal human blood temperature was established. That is the same temperature as the interior of a beehive. They maintain the normal temperature of human blood, and the bee is the occult symbol for Saturn. So, forgotten stuff, but very, very interesting. Steiner also related the triple goddess to these previous planetary conditions and to the ethers. The warmth ether, ancient Saturn, Rhea. Light ether, ancient Sun, Persephone. Chemical ether, ancient Moon, Demeter. Life ether, this is my addition, present Earth, the green man, possible. And here is a chart of the centric forces, and here you have the third force in the center, magnetism, electricity, and their electricity Demeter, old moon, magnetism, Persephone, old sun, third force, Rhea, old Saturn. And Steiner spoke about Mephistopheles' speech in Faust when he speaks about the mothers. When we look from this earth to Saturn, sun and moon, there we find the mothers that figure in another form in the Greek mysteries under the name Persephone, Demeter and Rhea. For all the forces that were in Saturn, sun and moon are still working on into our own time. And they were related to the inner earth by Steiner's pupil Walter Johannes Stein at a lecture in London in 1947. These three layers are the earth's past, the relic of its past still buried within it. At the central core lies old Saturn. Above it, the stratum, which is old Sun, and the outermost layer, coming beneath the mineral earthly surface, is the relic of old Moon, evolution. Mephistopheles spoke of the mothers with the greatest awe as goddesses unknown to men, and told Faust that he must burrow to the uttermost profound if he would find them in the ever-empty far. And of course, it's understandable that these regions were also connected to fallen beings. I haven't gone into that in too much detail, but that when Christianity came on the scene, they were hurriedly Christianized. And These locations were often sacred to the goddess in ancient times. Later, Christian churches built over the site usually had statues of the Black Virgin, and the Green Man is represented. And I went to Ely Cathedral years ago, and the official guide with her little thing pinned to her, I don't think she'd ever heard of the Green Man, and there were dozens of them all over the place, but completely sidelined. So Rhea, St. Anne, the Black Virgin, Persephone, the Virgin Mary, Demeter, Mary Magdalene. This is obviously open to discussion because this was one person's view, not mine, of how they had evolved. But I feel very strongly that the Black Virgin is the one connected to ancient Saturn. So here we have Black Virgin at Chartres, Our Lady under the Earth. She was there long before Christianity, apparently when Britain and Europe were still one mainland and you could walk backwards and forwards, so very, very ancient. Then in Turkey, in Ephesus, where St. John and the Virgin Mary went, Ephesus has always been sacred to the goddess. And there was a temple of Isis there, and the great temple of Diana Artemis, which was one of the 7 wonders of the world. And here you have Diana of Ephesus. And in the 19th century, a German nun had a vision of the Virgin Mary while she was on her deathbed. And the Virgin described that the last home she had had on earth was in Ephesus. How she described the next bit I don't know, but she told the nun exactly where her house would be found if people went and looked in Ephesus. So the priest obviously took some notice, and people went to Ephesus and they uncovered the Virgin Mary's house. It was found on a hilltop above the old town. It is the most beautiful place. I mean, it is slightly nearby all the terrible plastic things and flashing lights and stuff you buy at those sort of places, but very peaceful, very beautiful. And I took my pendulum with me and took water there was water flowing underneath the Virgin Mary's house. All 9 resonances were present. But these resonance patterns change. Lots of research has to be done to find out how they change. It's something to do with the planetary movements, with the zodiac. I went in February, there were 9 patterns, but they were of a particular type. I went back in July, and they were still 9 patterns, but all different. And as all of you know, where there are faults and where geological strata meet fallen etheric energy, manifesting as a very weak form of etheric energy, this is funneled up to the surface and sometimes experienced as powerful earth energy, which is possible for human beings to transform to its original etheric state. So in a minute I will go into that in connection with the Knights Templar. And here is a geological map of Roslin. I'm very into geological maps because so often lots of clues can be found. And I took this to a friend whose husband was a geologist, no knowledge of anything that we're into, and I just said to him, well, can you tell me what is the significance of Roslin? There, you've got 2 colours. One is the Carboniferous limestone, that is well, I didn't know what it was. He said, well, those are the coal seams. And what happens is the water is trapped under the coal until it reaches the Carboniferous limestone, and then it rushes to the surface. So I have never been into the Glen Carn, but I presume that amount of water around a place would give it very special properties. And I actually rang Judy Fiskin, who was curator of Roslin at the time, and I asked her about it. She said, oh yes, she said, the old miners used to say they always knew when they were under Roslin because they'd come to the end of the coal and there was the Carboniferous limestone and they'd say, Roslin's up there. So that was wonderful corroboration. In his book, The Sword and the Grail, Andrew Sinclair has surmised that the name Roslin means Full, because the word lin in the ancient Scottish means full of the rosy blood of Christ. But I would suggest a possible alternative, dewful. Surely the dewful there could be very powerful. The word dew, German tau, is ros in Latin, and cross is crux. Ros crux means the same at the same time the sign tau, the cross, and the dew on the plants. This is the esoteric meaning of the rose cross. And the Giza plateau had an ancient name. It was twice dew. Ros tau was the ancient name for the Giza plateau. So the ancients knew that this connection with the dew was very important, as the alchemists did. Dew had very special properties. And Rudolf Steiner, we remember, described water as something formative, a shaping force, since through tone the parts are arranged in order. I'll go through that. But then we compare this to a statement by another anthroposophist, Thomas Meyer, filled with the sound of the Tau. This was the experience in Atlantis through millennia. Tau. This was what sounded for thousands of years, and the bodily form of man was built up in response. To the man of ancient Atlantis, the Tau once sounded forth from all things. Then, in the post-Atlantean time, it seemed to die away into silence. And yet, in times to come, it will be heard again in a new way. It will resound within man himself. And a lot has been said about the possibility of the Holy Grail being found at Rennes-le-Chateau. I would say that it is, but not in the materialistic way people imagine. Rudolf Steiner describes the living forces, what sprouts and grows in the plants, and what manifests itself in animal and human reproduction, the life force itself, as the Grail. And here we have, again, the two higher ethers, the life and the chemical ether. And then we remember that not only is the Grail at Rennes-le-Chateau, but also the Tree of Life pillar. And we know that just a few miles up the hill from, or up the road from Rennes-le-Chateau, experiments were carried out to produce Dolly the sheep, to actually go into the Tree of Life energy and to reproduce it artificially. And so it's interesting that Rudolf Steiner then also, in addition to talking about the Holy Grail as the life force, he says, man has to leave these mysterious powers of nature untouched. There he cannot encroach. What results from these forces cannot be comprehended by him. And in the Sunday Times, it may be in the Scottish Times, some years ago, there was a picture of the Tree of Life pillar, and also a picture of the DNA spiral next to it. Below was a caption which read, "The Holy Grail of science meets the Holy Grail of medieval Christian law at Rennes-le-Chateau in Scotland." It's interesting that the Tree of Life pillar was also called the Apprentice pillar. Anybody see Fantasia? Here we go. There's Dolly. Mickey Mouse. Cloning brooms. And if we go back to Dolly, cloned sheep. How odd that that should have been also the sorcerer's apprentice. And some years ago, I found this statement which corroborates what we heard this morning. The basic structure of subatomic particles and of DNA have one thing in common. They can be explained in terms of the rules of music. While studying DNA's distinctive molecular composition, I came to realize that the genetic code was actually a biological manifestation of the Hermetic code, and as such presented the observer with a living example of the transcendental powers which can be practitioners of objective music. I do have the source for that, so I'll hunt it out. It was on that quote before, I apologise. The Knights Templar have also been connected with Rosslyn, and we know that the inner group of the Templars were dedicated to deep contemplation, prayer and meditation. And Rudolf Steiner describes how when human beings carry out an intense spiritual transformation within themselves, the effect of the nerves, which carry fallen etheric energy, electrical activity, is withdrawn from the blood, allowing pure etheric energy to replace it. And here you have the tree of knowledge, the human central nervous system, full of electrical impulses. So that when you actually tested, perhaps in hospital, it's the electrical impulses that they are testing. In Kirlian photography, it is that lower register of the etheric that is actually being recorded. The higher etheric is way beyond our reach except through meditative work. And Gunther Vaxmuth again describes how certain forces mould the body of the earth and of man in accordance with uniform, harmonious laws. This is why the destiny of man is bound up with the earth. The face of the earth becomes part of the destiny of man. The configuration of the etheric body of the earth is a reflection of our own inner being. The etheric forces moulding the body of the earth are the same as those in our blood corpuscles. If new etheric forces arise within the earth in the course of cosmic becoming, this reflects itself right into the corpuscles of human blood. On the other hand, when a change takes place in the etheric structure of human blood, this will be reflected into the etheric sphere of the earth, because in effect the earth and the blood corpuscles are formed according to the same laws. We are thus led into a quite different relationship with the earth, a truly Christian knowledge of the spirituality of the earth, to a Gaia Sophia. And, in Parzival, the Grail is described as a sort of cornucopia. And it says, for whichever liquor a man held out in his cup, whatever drink a man could name, by virtue of the Grail, he could see it there in his cup. And here you have a cornucopia and a vortex in water, similar shape, similar function, bringing from the bottom of the vortex something out of the spiritual dimension into the physical, a cornucopia of energy, manifesting all manner of things in the physical. And in Schwenk's book again, he describes how water creates an infinite variety of boundary surfaces which are sensitive to the slightest change in their surroundings by expanding, contracting, or making rhythmical waves. It is so sensitive that it doesn't only react to its immediate surroundings, but also to the delicate changing influences of the cosmos. If, for example, water is shaken in a container, it can be caused to move in such a way that inner surfaces are created which open the water as an organ which registers the precise conditions of the cosmos at the time when it was shaken. As soon as the shaking stops, the organ closes once more. Well, during the eclipse of the sun many years ago, I can't remember how many, I had been to the 9 resonance patterns course, and I was thinking, how can I use this information to the best possible advantage over the eclipse? If you water plants and then douse over the plants, you get different readings, you douse different resonant patterns. So, and at different times, which makes it very complicated. So if you have, say, 5 Christmas cacti, and you douse over them, having watered them, you get the same resonance pattern in the same series. If it's another sort of plant, it immediately changes to another pattern. If you do it at a different time, again the pattern changes. So huge experiments to be done on that. So I watered a basil plant, I took it into the garden, and I held the pendulum over it, and it gave me the patterns for that basil plant. As the sun began to be covered, the pendulum went slower and slower and slower. At total eclipse, it stopped. Then I waited, and as the sun was revealed again, it began to move, doing those same patterns that it had done before for the basil plant, until it was moving normally. Then I rang a friend who said, "Oh, Sylvia, did you douse during the eclipse?" I said, "Yes, I did." She said, "I did." She said, "My pendulum went absolutely mad at total eclipse because I was dowsing the Earth. The sun forces were screened out. Only Earth forces were left. Cosmic forces, as we know, are directed to the Earth via the sun. So there was absolutely nothing during total eclipse." Then I was really excited because in that same book by Francke, who I've been quoting from, he describes how 10 jars of water were labelled at the time of an eclipse with times about 10 minutes apart. These jars were shaken during the eclipse at the precise times given on the jars, and then grains of wheat were germinated in each jar afterwards. The wheat germinated before the eclipse grew to its normal size, and then he made a graph of how the wheat behaved during the eclipse. So, region of total eclipse, no growth at all. I knew nothing about this experiment, so I was very excited to have, sorry, I hope you heard the rest of it, to have found that there was an experiment done. Well, this method of creating these boundary surfaces was developed by John Wilkes, and his flow forms have become permanent features in all sorts of places. They can be put in towns, they can be put rather as a fountain would be. This is the one in Chalicewell Gardens. And this summer, thanks to Marion, I was introduced to a lovely man who has begun a sort of paradise on Mount Canigou, just in the Pyrenees. It's the most powerful, very, very powerful place. Only 2 years ago, he started developing this wonderful place with, on the side of Canigou, and he has continued John Wilkes' work. So there are flow forms all over the place. He can sleep. I don't know how many people at this centre, so do come to me if you want to know about it. 10 kitchens he's put in, so you can do your own thing. And there is a reed bed system with a flow form, a swimming pool that needs no chlorine whatsoever, and that's the scene from the house. Paradise within 2 years, and butterflies and dragonflies. And here we have the butterfly, and Rudolf Steiner, this is in memory of Stanley Messenger, who inspired the gatekeeper butterfly. He was a great butterfly man. And Rudolf Steiner spoke of the butterfly, saying, "The butterfly is a being on whose exterior the cosmos may be said to lavish all its beauties, is a creature on which everything of beauty and majesty in the cosmos has, as it were, alighted together with the dust on its wings. We must therefore picture butterfly nature as a mirror which reflects the beauty of the upper cosmos, which is an echo of paradise." So here we have butterflies are connected directly back to the paradise state, ancient Saturn, heat and the warmth ether, ancient sun, light and the light ether. Plants are now butterflies anchored to the earth. since the fluid systems were introduced, the plant is always longing for the paradise state, but the butterfly brings paradise back to the plants. And to finish, the gatekeeper butterfly. So thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was absolutely fascinating.
Debt Free TV, in association with GetOutOfDebtFree.org.